Let's just be very Darwinian about this. Seniors, quite frankly, are too expensive and not productive enough. I don't know if you agree with that thesis, but they're going to need to be less expensive and more productive if our society is going to, maintain its economic vitality, if you will. So start with the economics.
So as an economist, I hear a lot about an aging society, which is there's more people aged over 65 than there's ever been. And that's a problem. Old people get ill, they need a pension, they don't work. But we underestimate the capacity of old people.
Professor, where does this podcast find you?
In New York, actually.
Let's bust right into it. Walk us through your idea of an evergreen agenda.
Yeah, so I think, we hear a lot about AI and climate change as these big trends are going to change our future, which clearly they are. We have lots of engaged debates about how we adapt and adjust to them. But we rarely talk about something I think is incredibly important, which is how we adjust to our new longer lives. Instead, we talk about an aging society where there just being all these more old people. But the really fundamental change that's happened is the young can now expect to become the old. In the US, 50% of children born today are expected to live into the late 80s. And we're just not prepared for that length of life. We have to do what I call a three-dimensional longevity dividend. We already have long lives. We've got to make sure they're healthier for longer and productive for longer. And I think that's a great opportunity if we seize it, but we're not currently set up to seize it. So we struggle. So we have to be evergreen. We have to invest in our future because we have a lot more of it, and it's never been as important to do so.
So give us the fundamentals of how you set yourself up for an evergreen future as a society or a country.
Well, as a society, as a country, I think there's a bunch of things to be done. The first is we've got to have a health system that really focuses upon health. We've got a health system that's done brilliantly at making us live for longer. It's kind of slowed down the dying process, hasn't slowed down the aging process, and it intervenes when we get ill. And that's a problem when you have age-related diseases. We've got a system that says, hey, when a disease sufficiently manifests itself, that it's causing you a problem, come and see us and we'll try and look after you. But with aging-related diseases, once you get one of these things, the second one follows very, very quickly. The United States, around $12,000 per head is spent on healthcare. Only around $350 is preventative. So that's part of it. The second thing is, we hear a lot about social security problems, but again, looking at a systems level, we're very focused on making people work for longer by raising the social security age. But right now, people tend to leave the labor market from the age of 50. Age 50, about 80% of Americans are working. By the age of 65, it's down to a third. And that's not really to do with people choosing to stop work. They either get ill, they have to look for someone, they have to care for someone who's ill, their skills are out of date, or just ageism in the workplace. So how we keep people working from 50 up to the state pension age, I think, is a really key thing.
Peter Drucker, I think, said demographics are destiny. And it does feel like it's probably one of the biggest shifts in our society. I don't know if it's immigration but this feels like it's right up there. And that is just economically in the US, we're about to go more than 50% of our government spending is about to go to seniors. And also in the US, 70% of Americans are obese or overweight. So let's first start. It strikes me that we're going to have to make seniors more productive. Let's just be very Darwinian about this. Seniors, quite frankly, are too expensive and not productive enough. I don't know if you agree with that thesis, but they're going to need to be less expensive and more productive if our society is going to, maintain its economic vitality, if you will. So start with the economics.
So as an economist, I hear a lot about an aging society, which is there's more people aged over 65 than there's ever been. And that's a problem. Old people get ill, they need a pension, they don't work. But we underestimate the capacity of old people. And we've got to stop doing that. But I think the really big challenge is that, for me, we're focusing on the wrong thing. Because it's not an aging society with its focus on a change in the age structure of the population. The really, really big change is the young and middle-aged can now, for the first time ever in human history, expect to get old. And we fear getting old. We worry about outliving our health, our wealth, our finances, our relationships, our sense of purpose. So we have to act now to age well. So an aging society begins when you have lots of people aged over 65. A longevity society begins when you have lots of people who live to be over 65. So I think we've got to really think about this, because if we're not productive for longer over our life and we live for longer, we see a fall in the standard of living. So you're right, we've got to be more productive for longer. And that will, of course, involve more people working as their older, but it's more about a new map of life, I think. It's about thinking about a career that's going to last longer than before because you will need to be productive for longer. But right now, we have this notion that people get old at 65 and they're incapable of working, which isn't true. And it's certainly not true for everyone. And for those for whom it is true, we've got to stop that happening for the next generation because, as I say, if we're living a longer life, we want it to be a healthy one and we want it to be an engaged one.
So let's go to the health side. I'll put out a thesis: obesity. If we were to attack that, I mean, that would be a good start. But how do you take healthcare from being a defensive industry to an offensive industry, what you were calling preventive? What are the two or three things you would want to see happen in terms of our approach to healthcare or wellness?
So two or three things is where it gets tricky. So first of all, we as individuals have to do a lot more. David Cutler from Harvard says that the most underused person in the health system today is the patient themselves. You say you're ill, you turn up and you get treated. We have to take more responsibility for our own health. That has issues about inequality, which we can return to later, but we just got to be more mindful of our own health. In terms of the health system, I think we're at a world where potentially we hear lots of things about how wonderful big data and AI is. When it comes to health, it could be truly phenomenal because we can now do genetic screening very cheaply. We can find out the diseases that people are most susceptible to, and we can start to target treatments so that we catch them early and keep them healthier for longer. So that would be, I think, two of the major things. There's big challenges. The health system makes an awful lot of money from doing intervention. So the question of how we actually switch to prevention is, I think, going to be interesting. We perhaps need to have a system that's outside of the traditional health sector with its disease focus that provides cheaply access to the things that we need. Obesity is a very interesting one. I think what we need is a system that focuses upon certain key biomarkers, things that say, look, if you got this is a sign you're going to have disease problems later. And obesity clearly is a huge problem, particularly in the US and the UK, which stand out. So how do you change that? Some of it is around public health, and public health has been hugely effective in the past around smoking and drinking. We tend to be very cynical about it now, but I think we can do more in that area. Then you've got things like the GLP-1 drugs, Ozempic, and those things coming along, which, although my heart sinks a little bit, because wouldn't it be great if we can get behavior change to happen? At least the early evidence on those suggests they really could be a game changer in terms of bringing about future improvements in health.
But well, let me go personal. You're obviously one of the top domain experts in this world. What have you done personally? How do you approach your evergreen strategy, your longevity? What are the things you do that you think your neighbors and your colleagues and your peers are not doing?
Yeah, no, well, I think what's interesting about all of this stuff is that, you hear people out there doing these extreme lifestyle hacks. I haven't got the self-will or discipline to do that. So I tend to do the basic stuff. I try and eat better. I drink less. I sleep better. So all the basic stuff. And although that's getting a bit of a scientific makeover, what's really changed is my incentive to do it. At 58, I have to do things differently from my father at 58 and my grandfather at 58 because I have more future ahead of me. So some of that is just taking care of the basic hygienes. As an economics professor, I've probably always been mindful about money, so I think that's something that I have been fortunate to be able to do something about. But Scott, one of the things I've heard a great deal about this topic, it took me a while to get it, is we're living a longer life, and what's the point of it? You can sort of starve yourself at breakfast, you can do high interval training, etc. But there's a great quote by the Greek poet Pindar, which says the point of life is to become who you are, having discovered what that is. And that notion of adult development, of using a longer life to change and become who you want to be or to try and shift and to say, who really am I? And I think that's the really interesting thing about longevity. My father, born in 1925, was never a teenager. He went from being a child to an adult at 14. We rushed adult development. We're sort of extending adult development now. I look at my children in their 20s and 30s doing things very differently from me. But it's not just about that first stage. I think we've got scope to try and say, actually, what do I want to do and how do I spend my time? And we're so hardwired to think of aging as about decline. We've medicalized old age. So I do hope that that's focused on adult development and saying, hey, I've always done this, but is that really what I want to try and do? So for me, that's the one I perhaps struggle with or focus on the most. the very human thing about longevity. I think, the extreme supplements and stem cell stuff gets out of the real point of this is how do we spend that time?
Obviously, you want people to live long, happy lives. Societies go into decline when their birth rate drops. I'm going to make a very reductive thesis that as more and more of our revenues go to supporting and caring for seniors, we lack the investment, the forward-leaning investments that grow the economy. The economy, and couple that with inequality, doesn't present a very optimistic future for young people. They stop having kids, and your society becomes less productive. You have you don't have, I don't know what's the term. It's not population decline, it's population denigration. And I always hear this notion that, okay, we have to make our seniors more productive. And this is gonna sound ageist. I'm not sure they're interested in being more productive. Is that wrong?
Well, I think, one of the things is like I'm not sure how useful it is to talk about people being old. Aging is a really diverse process, and we have a rather monolithic concept of people after age 65. So I kind of agree with you. It's not that all old people need support. I think we need to be much more shrewd in thinking about, for instance, in London, you get a free travel pass if you're over 60. That's kind of daft when you're an investment banker cycling to the tube station to go to work. So we've got to think less of age as telling us something about people and think more of them as individual circumstances. So I think, for me, you're right, though. I think the challenge in aging society, it always becomes about care homes and adult diapers. But the people who have the longest life expectancy, for whom the standard life course is no longer working, is the young. In the book, there's that great Coretta Scott King quote: "The failure to invest in youth reflects a lack of compassion and a colossal failure of common sense." The young are the ones who have the longest life. And right now, that traditional lifestyle of raising a family, achieving financial security, and looking forward to retirement just isn't going to make sense for them. So I think we need some pretty profound changes. But that's all part of what I call the longevity agenda, because if the young have a reasonable expectation of living to 100, my goodness, how do they support that longer career? But I do think we need institutions to support people doing what they want. And your point about the falling birth rate, I'm not sure how much of that is choice versus circumstance. It does seem that people around the world want to have fewer children. Now, I've got 3 kids. I think having kids is great, but there does seem to be something about the world, the modern world, which is partly to do with expense. It's expensive to raise a family, but people do seem to want to have fewer children, and I think that's a really part of this fundamental change has occurred to us as humans. We now have very long lives, and we want to do things differently, but our social institutions are set up based upon old ways of behaving.
100% agree with you on the kind of the looking at social programs through the lens of age is the right way to do it. That Social Security in the U.S. should be renamed if it were on a senior security, because it seems like we're not just basing criteria on who needs it, but based on age. Do you think there'll be significant changes in public policy that says in the U.S., the wealthiest generation in history is seniors? And there's still a huge problem. A lot of seniors are retiring without money. But one, do you advocate for some sort of means test where a wealthy banker and, 70, 80 doesn't get Social Security? And also, what do you think of these plans to give kids, $7,000 on birth? They can't touch it. You treat them like infants. And then when they're 65, based on previous market performance, they might end up with $1 million or something. What do you think of these kind of, what economic ideas or what public policy ideas do you think we should be more seriously considering?
Well, the only thing I'd say about giving kids money at that age, the asset management industry would love it, but I'm not sure it solves the real problem. So I think we tend to think the aging society story is about a pension issue. It's really about how we create resources over our lifetime. And finances doesn't, the rate of return you get on the stock market depends upon the underlying performance of the economy. Now, just to go back to some of the issues you talk about the economy, I don't know, a question I like to ask people is how much growth do you think in employment over the last 10 years has come from workers aged over 50? It's now the majority of employment growth in the rich countries. So in America, it's 2/3 of employment growth the last 10 years is workers aged over 50. In my country, it's 75%. In Europe, it's over 100%. There's not much productivity growth these days. So all GDP growth is coming from employment growth, and all of that is coming from older workers. So I think for me, the key thing in all of this is how do we keep people active and engaged for longer? And of course, at 20, that might not seem important, but the thing that's changed is 20-year-olds now can become a 50 or 60-year-old. I was talking to some Chinese students the other day, and I was showing them China's demographics, which are horrific compared to America's. Population's falling, number of people aged over 65 is going to be 45%. And I said to these 30-year-olds, how do you feel about all these 65-year-olds in the future? And they said, it's terrible. All these old people, they get ill, they need a pension. And I said, who are they? And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, who are these old people? They said, well, they're old people. I said, "No, they're you. They are you in 35 years' time." And that's the really tough change because for most of human history, the young haven't become old. So we've got to make sure the young age well in a way that is productive, healthy, and engaged. And there's, I think, no policies around that right now. Government seems shocked when I tell them, hey, you know what? At 50, 4 out of 5 people are working. At 66 in America, only 1 in 3 are. If you could half that decline, that's a 4% increase in GDP every single year. So that's a lot of money. It's the nearest thing to a macroeconomic free lunch that I can find. So, that would be where I would absolutely laser focus on how do I keep people working from 50 to 65. And of course, once you start thinking about that, you realize that someone who's 30 and in bad health with obesity, they are not going to be working at 50. So you're just storing up these really big problems.
You had referenced China, and I read this crazy stat that I think when I was born, the average life expectancy in China was something like 45, and it's now surpassed the US. What has China done so right over the last generation to it has to have had the most remarkable increase in longevity likely registered in history, no?
Yeah, and that's why China's got this dramatic aging society problem because it's had this dramatic increase in life expectancy and a very big fall in the birth rate in a very short period of time. So it's got that huge change in the age structure, which America has got a much more modest version of. Kind of what's happening in America is that in the future, you're going to have the same number of people of all ages from 0 to 80, basically. That's kind of where we're going to. Whereas China, you've got one child policy, so you've got one kid, two parents and four grandparents, which is just very unusual. What do they do right? Well, they kind of did what everyone else did. I mean, one of the big things to do is to lower infant mortality, and that's about nutritional intake of expectant mothers. It's sanitation and hygiene. All of that gives a really big improvement. I think as you have fewer kids, you spend more time nourishing and looking after them. We know, for instance, that parents spend more time with children now than they used to. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I'm not sure, but they do. They've done just very quickly what everyone else does. I think the more challenging issue you raise is how does China, with its GDP per head much less than America, have higher life expectancy than America? And America, the gap between American life expectancy and what's called best practice, the country with the highest, has now increased to 8 years. And I think that's a staggering challenge. As a macroeconomist, if US GDP declines, it's over the headlines, there's policy initiatives to do something about it. But this 8-year gap now between US life expectancy and countries such as Japan, that's a sign that things aren't right.
But isn't it because it's poor people dying, so we don't really give a shit?
Well, it's a lot about inequality, I agree, and I think if we could target we found what we know aging is malleable, and if you have low income and stressful work and poor environment, you age more rapidly. So one of the things I think is so important is to have a target for healthy life expectancy in a country. At the moment, nowhere in government or the health system is there a target for healthy life expectancy. And I think if we did have one, we'd start to pay more attention to what would happen to inequality.
We'll be right back. So I want to pivot to another topic. Obviously you're known, or you're getting a lot of press and warranted attention for your focus on longevity, but you're a professor of economics at LBS. And I'm fascinated after being in London for 2 years. Amazing culture, some of the best academic institutions in the world, fantastic, or what I call institutions that typically lead to a very robust economy. Yet the UK hasn't grown in 5 years. 7 in 10 IPOs of the last decade are below their offering price. And one company in the US, Apple, is worth more than the entire FTSE. I realize it's a multidimensional problem, but what is it about the UK that it seems like it feels like it's doing something to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory, that it has all the underpinnings and the infrastructure of what should be a robust, growing, if slow growth economy. What does the UK get wrong?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't send us food parcels quite yet. I mean, we're still sort of doing all okay, but yeah, growth has disappeared as it has in much of Europe, and it's striking. Europe led the way with technology and telecoms, and now is so far behind. Part of that I think in Europe is the sort of whole single currency project, which has absorbed huge amounts of political focus on making that work. And of course, in the UK, we've had a Brexit, which has been, in a very British understated way, call it a distraction. And that's clearly not been very, very helpful. I would say the real challenge we've got around the world is that we've got innovation slowing. So, even in the US, this sort of measure of innovation macroeconomists have, total factor productivity growth, has slowed down. So, there's not much productivity growth for all the hype about AI is going to take away all our jobs. Right now, the issue we've got is we've got lots of people working. Unemployment's very low, but productivity is very low. So there's a shared global problem. Then demographics on top of that mean that you've got less population growth and you've got more old people leaving the labor force. But I would say that Brexit, for me, as an economist, and rightly or wrongly on the politics of Brexit, on the economics, it's not a good move to make it more difficult to trade with your richest neighbours on your doorstep. And at least that has short run costs. And then I would say that we're also seeing some issues around austerity from the financial crisis. UK is kind of 25% European and 75% American these days. So we also have challenges around inequality. So we're seeing a lack of infrastructure investment, and we're seeing problems around inequality and health. And I don't want to make it look like I'm a person with a hammer who's going to hit everything, sees everything as a nail. But in the UK, we have 3 million people who are unemployed long term because of health problems. And a large numbers of those are aged 50 to 65. So that's one of our challenges. As you have an aging population, health has first order macro consequences. In general, the UK has always been good at innovation. We're always good at inventing things. We're just not very good at then scaling them and implementing them. But no, what do you think, Scott? What do you see from being there? What do you find frustrating about British institutions, if we've got enough time for that?
My observation of London is that there's not a lot of organic value creation. That it strikes me it's a lot of people servicing wealth that has been created elsewhere. Let's look at AI. Some of the most impressive intellectual property around AI was developed at Cambridge, and I mean, it's literally as if they come up with ideas, and I don't know if they're not as risk aggressive. I don't know if the regulation is overdone. It's hard for me to understand. It was a genuine question why the UK doesn't have a single company really that's worth over 50 billion in AI, and yet there are startups in AI that are, get valued at 10 or 20 billion in the United States. It's just odd that the UK doesn't seem to be able to commercialize some of the innovation that they come up with. I just can't put my finger on it. I find the business environment in the US is, can we make money together? Yes or no. And in the UK, it's sort of like a very polite, definite maybe.
Yeah, no, I still, there's that cultural thing. It's been a really long-standing problem in the UK that we've got, you know, an education system that is in some ways really unstructured, which is great because you kind of have to learn things out yourself. And that's kind of leads to, I think, rather unequal education outcomes, but it's great at the top in terms of innovation, but it's never fed through. And then with a focus on global capital markets, you get, what we call the Wimbledon effect, which is that it's very rare that a Brit wins with the Wimbledon tennis tournament, but we kind of see it as globally one of the best in the world. And that's a little bit, I think, also the sort of the implication of having a global capital market based in your home country.
Do you think I read something that sort of captured my attention. I'm curious if you think there's any merit. The productivity, per your comments, is declining. And some economists are saying that the massive decrease in corporate tax rates um, tax revenues from corporations in the U.S. used to account for 3.5% of GDP. It's now 1%. Our corporate taxes are the lowest they've been since 1939, since the Trump tax cuts. And when you have taxes this low, corporations have a really good memory. They start returning more and more money to shareholders because there's less friction to get it out to them because it's taxed at a lower rate, and they invest less. And as a result, there isn't the same forward-leaning investments in plants, property, and equipment, which reduces growth. Have we cut taxes beyond kind of the ultimate balance, if you will? Is that hurting productivity?
So I think, certainly I would say in the UK that some of the fiscal austerity that led to cuts in government expenditure around health and education has definitely hurt overall economic growth, for sure. On the corporate tax one, the reason given for that is that as we've made capital more mobile, as firms can just relocate anywhere around the world, you've had to lower the tax burden on it, which means that you either have to increase the tax burden on labor or you cut the welfare state and benefits. And, I think that does risk losing inclusive growth. So I think that is a challenge. I see the returning of money to shareholders less around capital taxes and more around there's not things to invest in that produce that tangible growth. And I think that's, the example, people always point to is, when Facebook bought WhatsApp for, what was it, $17 billion, they could have bought Sony for the same amount of money. But rather than buy a company with 140,000 people, they bought, 35 mates getting together with a company. And I think that's kind of one of the challenges we've got now, which is sort of investing in intangible capital isn't very labor or capital intensive. It's more IP intensive. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot of money in global capital markets, but not a great deal of productive places to invest it in, which is why we're seeing shareholder returns and low rates of return.
So, just as we wrap up here, I want to switch to parenting. You have 3 kids. Based on your research, has it impacted the way you father or any kind of habits you're trying to build in or any practices or lifestyle changes you're really trying to endorse and urge your 3 kids to adopt?
I can barely manage my own life, so I kind of always reluctant to offer advice that other people's got. But it is an interesting motivation. I started writing Getting This World when I wrote a book called The 100-Year Life, and I just lost my parents. So you start to think about mortality. And I was seeing my kids make very different decisions to me, particularly my middle child who was just leaving university, good degree. He said, "Dad, I'm not going to get a job." And I was pissed. And I was trying to work out why. And there was a whole bunch of factors involved. One was I think I was jealous because at his age I was working as an economist in an investment bank. And is my life in any way, shape, or form better because of that? No. And here he was, good looking, young, going to travel around the world and have fun. I'd also was cross because, I paid for him to get through college and I'd gone without holidays, and here he was going to have a 2-year holiday. So that kind of annoyed me. And I was worried for him. But it made me realize that life is different. People are doing different things. And that got me thinking about changing the life course. So if that's an answer to your question, it's like I can't judge what kids are going through. I think we define children by technology and all this Gen Z type stuff. But actually, one of the really big things that's changing is they're going to grow up with me and their grandparents around for a lot longer than past generations. So working on that intergenerational stuff is key, and recognizing that hopefully they can learn from me, but I can learn a lot from them as well. Because if I want to be evergreen, I've got to think about things in a different way and learn it. And I'm unlikely to learn it from people who are my age doing what I do. I've got to be a bit more open-minded.
Andrew J. Scott is a professor of economics at London Business School, having previously taught at Oxford and Harvard University. He is also the co-founder of Longevity Forum, a consulting scholar at the Stanford Center on Longevity, and co-author of the global bestseller, The 100-Year Life. His latest book, The Longevity Imperative, Building a Better Society for Healthier, Longer Lives, is out now. He joins us from the great city of New York, in my opinion, always fighting for the top spot with London. And a huge oversight. I didn't ask you what your club was. What football club do you support, Professor?
It's a private grief. I'm a Spurs fan. One of the reasons I'm
Spurs, son.
yeah, absolutely. But one of the reasons I hope for a long life is I might eventually see us win something, but we'll see.
Yeah, my oldest is Spurs. Well, I've probably been to a dozen Spurs games. The nicest venue in the UK. We got that going for us.
Well, let me know. I've got 3 season tickets. I go with my 2 boys. They can't always make it. So if you,
Done. Done
Fine.
and done.
Okay.
We love it. Well, anyways, Professor, really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Pleasure to talk.